How are you all doing? What a beautiful country you have here. I like it a lot. It reminds me of Kansas. No, Kansas with an ocean and a proper it's not anything like Kansas. But it is, our countries are similar in all sorts of interesting ways, you know, the vast open spaces, the natural wealth, prosperous middle-class societies. And we both, the United States and Australia, are countries filled with people who have for whom democracy is a way of life. It's not just a political system. It's a living thing. You know, we have this visceral hatred for aristocracy and pretense of all kinds. But tonight I want to talk about a way in which we're different, and how the United States has, in the course of my lifetime, gone down a political road where I implore you not to follow us. So I started out in journalism back in the orange-fingered sunset of the Ronald Reagan administration. And the rise of the conservative movement, I thought back in those days, was, and I think still, the most consequential development of my lifetime. And understanding it, trying to get an understanding of it, is where I decided to focus my energies. And what eventually came to fascinate me as I tried to understand conservatism was the paradox of the thing. Our Republican Party in the United States had, you know, as I examined them, these people had successfully inverted their historical brand image as the party of the highborn. They had remade themselves as, you know, plain-speaking pals of the forgotten man who had spurned them during the Great Depression. Now, the payload of republicanism, however, was exactly the same as it has always been, exactly the same as it was in the 1930s. That never changed. And now, today, just look at what conservatism has done to those average Americans once they welcomed it into their lives. What have its achievements been? Let's go down the list. There's the tax cuts, of course. They've managed to destroy the power of the labor movement in America. They've deregulated so much that you now have these, you know, disastrous financial crises brought on by fraudulent behavior in industries that the rest of the world foolishly thinks we still police. We don't. The days when the U.S. government got tough with monopolies and investment banks, those days are over. Now, there are hundreds of objective statistical ways of describing how my country has changed since the early 1980s. The houses we live in are bigger, much bigger. University is massively more expensive. The university where I got my PhD today costs $70,000 a year to attend. That's in American money. Student debt, as you might predict from a statistic like that, student debt is growing rapidly in the United States. Union density is way down. Members of Congress routinely quit to become lobbyists. The price of a certain pill recently went from $13 to $750 overnight. And the Dow Jones average is above 25,000. Another set of numbers for you. If you look at these developments over time, from the middle of the 1930s up until the year 1980, the lower 90% of the American public, a group we might call the American people, those people took home 70% of the growth in the country's income. That was the middle class society. That's the country I was born into. That's the way I thought it would always be. If you look at the same numbers beginning in 1997, from the middle of the dot-com bubble up until the present, you'll find that this same group, the American people, pocketed none of my country's income growth at all. The upper 10% of the population, by which I mean America's financiers and managers and professionals, they ate the whole thing. Back in 1980, According to an American labor group, American CEOs made about 40 times as much as their average blue-collar employee. Today, it's 361 times. One amazing number I came across just the other day from Money Magazine is that Jeff Bezos, currently the richest man in the world, the CEO of Amazon, earns as much in 9 seconds as his average employee does in a year. One particularly lucky American family has as much wealth as does 40% of the country's population put together. Now, the main accomplishment of the 6 high-achieving people who make up this fortunate bunch, their main accomplishment was to inherit shares in Walmart, the retailer that has sucked the life out of thousands of middle American towns. I mean, truly, folks, the rich people of today make the rich people of my childhood look like Soviets. Now, these are, everything I just described, these are staggering changes. And they're even more staggering still when you think about the politics that made it all happen, okay? Take the conservative movement's signature economic ideas, for example. Privatize everything. Let Wall Street run the economy. Get tough with workers and let wages fall where they may. Think about this for a second. With a few exceptions here and there, these ideas have never enjoyed mass public approval. These are not the kind of things for which people clamor and rally by the millions out in the streets. Were we to stage every election in the United States as a referendum on this economic philosophy, and were the two parties to take forthright positions on privatizing, financialization, and so on, every election would be a wipeout. The conservative movement would lose every single time. That's not how things have worked out, obviously. What happened is the conservatives in my country took a deeply unpopular economic agenda and made it the sort of elite consensus wisdom, not only of my country, but of the entire world. And that is the story, folks. That is the story of our time. That is the story of our lives. How'd they do it? How the hell did this happen? Well, let's to start on an answer. Look, this is a discontented age, and the Republican Party back in the United States is very comfortable with discontent. They are, and this is where the sort of cultural history of all this comes in. These guys, you know, they're not complacent. They're not like the high-born Republicans of old. They are endlessly aggrieved. They do not invoke the divine right of money. They don't demand that the lowly learn their place in the great chain of being. On the contrary, they tell us that they are themselves enemies of the elite. They are the voice of the unfairly persecuted. They represent, you know, a righteous protest of the people on history's receiving end. You know, they're right with you as you sit in front of the TV and watch some Hollywood star insult your values and mock your way of life. There was a conservative leader back in the 1970s. One of his mottos was organized discontent. These are conservatives. Organized discontent, he would say. And that's what they do. And they're very comfortable doing that. They're not afraid to do it. And when they do this, they deliberately mimic people like us. They deliberately mimic the historical left. That's what the Tea Party movement was. It was a fake hard times protest movement. You know, deliberately ginned up to look like the real deal from the 1930s. Or, I mean, the case in point, the one that we're all talking about, Donald Trump. Look at his presidential campaign. By the way, they called him the blue-collar billionaire. But if you look at his campaign, he deliberately tried to make it look like he was leading some kind of old-style left-wing protest movement. His final TV commercial, for example, that was running on TV in the last couple weeks before the last 1 week before the election, attacked what Trump called the political establishment. And he defined it like this. Now listen, these are Trump's words. This is Trump I'm quoting here. It's a global power structure that is I can't do his accent. I just can't do it. Some people can, but I cannot. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class. And by the way, he actually used that phrase, the working class, Democrats rarely use that. They're allergic to that term. Trump used it. A global power structure has robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money in the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. This is Trump speaking here. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. If you didn't know who was saying that, you'd think, that's kind of idealistic. That's kind of all right. That's the kind of thing that I might say, if you didn't know any better, right? Trump versus the global power structure that has robbed us all until, of course, he gets into office, secures that massive tax cut, deregulates the banks again, does these huge deregulatory favors for the corporations, the very people he just denounced. By the way, conservatives across the board love to talk about the betrayed working class of America. They love to do it. It's not just Trump. They all do it. It is cynical, and it can be, at times, incredibly perverse. There's a CEO of a coal mining company. He's not CEO any longer, but this company owned a mine. It was a famous mining disaster a few years ago, the Upper Big Branch disaster. 29 miners died. And this CEO later went to prison for violating safety rules. Anyhow, back in 2009, he threw a big Labor Day rally where he took to the stage and said that he was there to defend American labor because no one else will. And like Trump, the CEO said he was standing tall against our government leaders who, with their safety and environmental meddling, he called American workers' worst nightmare. This is the CEO of the company that owned the Upper Big Branch mine. And folks, they have been talking this way for decades. It goes on and on and on, and they win. How do they get away with it? If we want to try to answer that, we have to shift our focus to the other party in the American system, the Democratic Party. These are the guys charged with keeping the Republicans in check and making sure that they pay for it when they cause a financial crisis or when they tell working people that they're on their side. And guess what? The Democratic Party isn't particularly interested in the job that I just described. Take the most glaring example in recent history, President Obama's response to the financial crisis. It's now 10 years ago that happened. And if you remember what it was like in 2008, here he was, this inspiring figure, this unbelievably eloquent man, a brilliant man. He seemed like exactly the right man for the moment. I mean, that's what I thought, anyways. I thought here was my generation's Franklin Roosevelt. And he was elected in this massive wave of hope and enthusiasm. And he had the country at his back. He had the world at his back. And then he proceeded to continue the bank bailout policies of President Bush, essentially unchanged. No big banks ever got put into receivership. No bailouts were unwound. No elite bankers were ever prosecuted for what was an obvious wave of fraud. Anybody could see that. None of them even got fired, which he had the total authority to do. So Obama and his Democratic team refused to change course when every sign was telling them it was time to turn, when it would have been good for the country to turn. I mean, economically healthy to be shed of this, to take this industry down, to diminish their power once and for all. When it was fully within their power to turn. When it would have been overwhelmingly popular with the public to turn. Had he done it, we'd amend the Constitution, he'd still be president today. Okay, I'm exaggerating just a little bit there. And lastly, when the country fully expected him to turn the wheel. I mean, that's what we thought we were doing when we elected him. We're going to make a change. I mean, even the Wall Street bankers thought that this is what was going to happen. They thought he was going to take them to the woodshed. They thought, here comes the Roosevelt of our generation, and he is going to, he's going to do what the original Roosevelt did. Instead, he foamed the runways for the bankers, in the immortal phrase of his Treasury Secretary. They foamed the runways for these guys. Why? Why didn't Obama take this golden opportunity to blast Republican policies and to shore up the middle-class society when it was right in front of him, when he had, it was totally within his grasp to do it? Why didn't he do it? To answer that, I think you have to go back into the history of the Democratic Party. You have to go back to the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, when the party was basically in a kind of civil war with itself, the different factions of the Democratic Party fighting and fighting and fighting and grappling over the party's identity, who they were and what they stood for. And there's all of these different reform factions in the party back then, and they fought like cats and dogs, but they all agreed on one thing. And that was that the Democratic Party had to turn away from the legacy of the 1930s with its fixation on working class people. What the Democrats could no longer be, they said, was the party of organized labor. The links had to be broken. They had to be a different party that spoke for a different group. The man who finally brought closure to that long civil war in the Democratic Party was Bill Clinton, who came to Washington and brought a new kind of Democratic administration along with him. And rather than paying homage to the policies of Franklin Roosevelt, as all Democrats used to always do, but rather than do that, Clinton did these amazing favors for Roosevelt's old enemies. He's the one, he deregulated the banks. This is the guy that got it done. He ensured that derivative securities would be traded without supervision. He deregulated radio and telecoms. He basically put an end to the federal welfare system. This is something most people don't know in my country. In 1997, he arrived at a secret deal with Newt Gingrich, a Republican leader, a secret deal to privatize our Social Security system. Fortunately for the country at this point, the Monica Lewinsky scandal intervened, and that particular scheme never came to pass. So Clinton was kind of an interesting guy. He had a strategy as both a candidate and then later on as a president, in which he would go out of his way to insult or to distance himself from some traditional Democratic constituency. And in this way, he would assure the public that he wasn't captive to what used to be called special interests. Okay, and he did this a number of times. It was very famous back in those days. And eventually, this strategy became a full-blown philosophy of governance, right? Body slamming the people that had just got you elected. And the most famous example is what the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which was it's called a free trade agreement, but it's actually an investment protection agreement. It was negotiated by the Reagan and Bush senior administrations, but because Congress in those days was controlled by Democrats of the old school, they could never get it through Congress. They would, the labor unions were, strongly opposed to it, and Democrats in Congress were opposed to it as well. So here comes Bill Clinton, and he got her done. He ran a steamroller over those Democrats in Congress. And here's where the story gets really interesting. When he rammed this through, he wasn't just insulting organized labor. He was conniving in their ruin. He was assisting in the destruction of their economic power. He did his part to undermine his own party's greatest ally, to ensure that in any future bargaining situation, management would always have the upper hand over their workers. When they try to organize or go to bargain for a new contract or something like that, because henceforth management can always threaten to move the plant to Mexico or somewhere else like that. They can always, and they threaten this all the time, by the way. You talk to union officials in America, and they say it comes up in every negotiation. Management, make any demand. They're like, I think we'll move the plant. We're gonna go somewhere else. Anyhow, in passing NAFTA, it wasn't just an insult. Clinton made the problems of working people materially worse. And working people remembered. And NAFTA came back to haunt the Clinton family in a huge way in 2016, with Trump, going around the country and promising to renegotiate it in every speech he gave. Anyhow, to continue with our story of the 1980s and 1990s, Democrats are figuring out who they are, who they're going to serve, what kind of party they want to be. And they decided, as I mentioned before, that they didn't want to be the party of labor any longer. And what they decided that Democrats had to embrace instead was the emerging post-industrial economy and the people that the Democratic Party needed to identify with specifically. I mean, nothing wrong with recognizing that we're in this, in this new era, but where it gets fascinating is that they decided that the people they were going to identify with were the winners in this emerging new order, the highly educated professionals who populate our innovative knowledge industries. And what I mean by professionals, we all know what, lawyers, doctors, clergy, etc. But in America, it's now an enormous category of workers. So it includes people like math PhDs who work on Wall Street and write derivative securities, biochemists who work for big pharma, making prescription drugs. Now, go back to the 1950s, and professionals as a group were one of the most Republican demographics in America. Today, they're one of the most Democratic groups. They've completely switched sides. And with them has gone the Democratic Party. That's who the Democrats are today. They are a party, they're a class party. It's just not the working class. They're the party of highly educated professionals. This is the constituent group that they care about. Now, we all know the Democratic Party in America has many other constituent groups, minorities, women, the young, the list is very long. But professionals are the ones who come first. And it's their tastes and their manners that are always celebrated by liberal newspapers, their favorite TV shows, their artisanal cupcakes, their handcrafted cocktails, all this stuff. I mean, the press in America is endlessly fascinated by artisanal stuff. The other day I saw an article about artisanal charcoal. Never even heard of that before, anyhow. But it's always this class, this group, and their particular way of regarding the world that is taken for granted by liberals in my country as being objectively and obviously true. So the Democratic Party in my country started as a populist movement. It was founded by Thomas Jefferson. But today it is the opposite of that. It is a movement of winners and the highly credentialed. And it is this shift of allegiance from the traditional working class and the middle class to professionals that explains, I think, everything that is frustrating about our modern day left in America. I mean, think about it, folks. How do you get a situation where inequality is growing? I mean, it's out of control in the United States, where we are headed back to a 19th century pattern of income distribution, and where the party of the left can't take advantage of it. They can't figure out how to do it. These things are going on, and the party of the left in my country is in a state of historic defeat, where the middle class is disintegrating, and people are turning to a mountebank like Donald Trump. How is this possible? It is only possible, folks, when the party of the left isn't interested in its historic mission. That is the only way you get this combination of inequality and defeat. What does a party of the professional class look like? What does it believe in? Well, the most important item on the list, the number one item, pretty much the only item, is meritocracy, which is the opposite of solidarity. Okay? Meritocracy is the conviction that the successful deserve their rewards, and that the people on top in our society are up there because, God damn it, they are the best. This is the first commandment, the only commandment of the professional managerial class. Everyone gets what they deserve, and what they deserve is defined by how they did in school. Okay? So the only solution for inequality in their minds, and you've heard this before, I'm sure, the only solution for inequality is you got to go to a really top-rank college, really top-rank university, right? So they look at all those farmers out in rural Missouri or somewhere watching their way of life fall apart, blow away in the wind, and they say, well, that's the answer. You need to go to Harvard or something like that. That's the answer for you, farmers. Folks, this is not a philosophy for tackling inequality or for reducing inequality. This is a philosophy for rationalizing inequality. It always comes back to you. It's always your own fault. You know, because the way you screwed up in grade school, you didn't get a gold star from the teacher, or you didn't finish high school, or you did finish high school, but you didn't go to university, or maybe you did go to university, but you didn't go to a good school, or maybe you did go to a good school and you studied the wrong subject. You know, it's always your own fault. Endlessly pushing the blame back onto you. Folks, this is a philosophy of winners, and the Democratic Party in my country is a party of winners. That is our left party in the United States today, a party of new economy winners. And it is their high-minded abandonment of their traditional principles that has made Trumpism possible. It's made Trumpism inevitable. And as I look out over the wasteland of American politics, okay, a happy note now. Let's end on a happy note. As I look out over the wasteland of American politics, I am increasingly convinced that there is really only one set of successful politics for an age of inequality like the present one. And that set of politics naturally favors the party of the left, the party of labor. The way Trump succeeded was by pretending to be the heir to populists' past, acting out this role. He used to be on TV. He'd play a billionaire, and now he's out campaigning and playing this role of a rough-hewn reformer who detests the powerful and cares about people like us. And now it is the turn of my Democrats to take it away from him. They're going to have to change. And they're going to have to fire their consultants. And they're going to have to stand up to their donors. And they are certainly going to have to find the courage to dump the ideology of the 1990s, this catechism of tech, bank, and globe that everyone can now see is nothing but an excuse for an out-of-touch elite. But the time has come. History is calling. Thank you very much.